And yeah, we're here because there is a disturbing, disappointing, concerning trend going on out there. We're going to talk a little bit more about the exact numbers of what's happening. Because with all of the closures of local stations and local newspapers, this is creating what some are calling news deserts or local news poverty. That means that citizens in small towns and medium-sized towns and sometimes even big towns don't have any access to reliable, reputable local news service. And so we're going to talk a bit more about that and about what it means and why we should all be concerned about it, and what some of the knock-on effects are when a local news service shuts down. I want to introduce our panel a little bit more. April Lindgren is an adjunct professor at the School of Journalism at Toronto Metropolitan University. And she is the founder of something called the Local News Research Project, which I highly recommend you check out if you're interested in this topic. It has an excellent crowdsourced local news map, which tracks changes across Canada and North America in terms of who's shutting down, who's opening up. It's a really good source of information. Alex Friedman is the Executive Director of the Community Radio Fund of Canada, which supports more than 235 community, Indigenous, and campus radio stations. He's also a former colleague of mine. He's a former investigative journalist with the CBC, which I should have said, that's where I work. I'm a managing director at CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And Leslie Lotto is the founder and creator of a business called Remote News Service, which provides local newscasts to radio stations across the US. She's also worked as a podcaster, a news reporter, and an anchor herself, and so brings a great perspective to this topic. So welcome to the panel. We give them a round of applause before we get going. So April, I want to start with you, and as I said, we're not going to spend this whole session documenting misery, as you've described it, but can you give us a quick snapshot of what's happening and why it's happening, if you have a bit of insight into that?
Sure. So the local news map actually unfortunately just tracks changes in Canada. I wish it tracked the United States, although I'd still be working 24 hours a day to do that. We're a smaller market, so it makes it a little more manageable. So we started tracking changes, which means what's closed, what's open, service increases, service reductions, mergers that result in a new news outlet in 2008. And so we have data for more than 15 years worth of data now. And every 2 months, I was getting lots of calls from people asking to extract data from the map. So we started producing a report every 2 months that summarizes it. So if anybody's looking for sort of summary data, our latest report was from April 1st. And you can just go on the localnewsresearchproject.ca and you can find those reports. But what does it say, the summary data? Well, since 2008, as of April 1st, 566 local news outlets have closed in Canada in 372 places. Now, community newspapers account for 75% of those changes, but one of the trends we're seeing more recently is that there's increasingly an impact on television stations and radio stations. So in the case of radio stations, for instance, we've tracked 39 private radio stations that have closed since 2008, but just over a quarter of those, 11 have shut down in the last 2.5 years. So very much an uptick in the challenges in the radio sector. And of course, there's also the reductions in newsrooms that's happening at the same time, increasing what I call local news poverty, which is where news organizations where people can't get the news they need to navigate daily life on a regular basis from the news organizations in their community. We did a bit of a deep dive into the data about a year ago, and we're going to refresh that. But what we found when we looked in more detail is that 171 of the closings happened in places with fewer than 10,000 people. So smaller communities are being very much hard hit by the losses. And 60% of all closings have happened in places with fewer than 50,000 people. And also just in recent years, there's been very much a trend of the closing happening in places where the median income is lower than the median income in Canada in general. Large media companies have closed were responsible for most of the closings, about 60%, whereas smaller media outlets who have, say, fewer than 3 properties accounted for many fewer, just less than 20%. Now, on the launches side, what's new? We had about half as many news organizations have launched since 2008 and remained in business, about 283, in about half as many places. Another 145 launched but didn't make it, they closed. And about just over 40% of those were digital or online news organizations. And again, just to demonstrate the challenges for small communities, only 47 of these new outlets launched in places with fewer than 10,000 people. And if you recall the earlier statistics I mentioned, that's compared to 171 that closed in these smaller places. So that kind of, as I say, that's the documenting of misery. And I hope we will get a chance to talk about opportunities as we proceed.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, though. It is good to get that snapshot. And obviously, it's a net loss, right? There have been some openings. Not all of those have made it. And I'm fascinated to notice that we think, oh, well, newspapers are just going from a print version to an online version, so they're still there as a source of news. But often when that happens, there's a reduction in the number of reporters and staff when they make that conversion, right?
Definitely, and that's the other piece of the puzzle that we don't track, which is layoffs and the reduction in newsroom sizes. So for instance, when I was working as a reporter at the Ottawa Citizen in 1990, there were 190 journalists in the newsroom, and today there's fewer than 24. And similarly, the Kingston Week Standard, I was just writing about this in a piece I did for the Walrus. In Kingston, in the early 90s, they had 69 people in their newsroom. They were winning Michener Awards. Today, there's five people on the editorial staff at the Kingston Week Standard.
Yeah, so that's not even captured in the closing. That's the reduction.
That's completely separate. And that's in a place where I wrote about this couple that were watching their local television station, which had become the real source. It was one of those stations that was very much of the community, and it was the go-to place. And they turned their TV on to watch the 6 o'clock news, and they got a blank screen one day in August. And it was as Chorus cut back the reporting and staff there, as well as at the Chorus-owned radio stations in the community.
Right.
And for what it's worth, it also doesn't capture, we saw Bell, for example, lay off reporters in Montreal and Toronto. I mean, they have newsrooms without any reporters at all in some of the major cities in Canada. That's not going to be captured in April's data. And I love April's data, by the way. This is not a knock on that. But that's important to keep in mind, that there are fewer people on the streets asking the questions.
So Alex, what does that mean? What is the impact of that? So we as journalists and former journalists can sit and bemoan the loss of craft and the loss of jobs. But what does it mean in a community to lose a local news source? Because a lot of these sources, they're spot news, they're disaster news, they're survival information, but they're also community, connecting the community together.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of local news, what we lose when we lose local radio stations, local newspapers, and local television stations, is that connection to our neighbors. That sense of well-being that we get from understanding what's going on. We don't know where the traffic closures are in the case of an emergency. It doesn't do anybody any good on Cortez Island to be listening to a station from Vancouver who's telling you, where the power outages are. I mean, that sort of community connection is critically important. And I think we need to think of local news and information in a different model. It's not that here's your 6 o'clock news. You have morning show hosts who go on air and talk, with people in the community, with influencers in the community, with the mayor about what's going on. You get a sense of who these people are. Your community. And as we begin to lose these news outlets, it's really dangerous. And to speak to my commercial colleagues in the room, we were just in a session this morning where we were talking about the importance of where we're going, when Spotify is doing music, when Instagram is doing celebrity, what we are going to be in the future of radio and broadcast, is that connection on a local level, that understanding of what people are doing. And so, as we try to think about the net reinvention of this medium, when we lose news and information, we lose the capacity to have that conversation with our listeners, we are eroding at the viability of the station in its entirety. And I think that's what we're seeing in April's data, is that we're losing those stations because we don't have that key part of the conversation.
Right.
Can I just jump in a bit? I wrote this piece for the Walrus where I really wanted to merge the academic research and what the findings were in Canada and the US on the loss of local news with what we're seeing on the ground in Canada. And part of it spoke to what Alex talked about, but one of the things we could see is in a place like Cobourg, I spoke to people there who talked about how much more difficult it is now to find out what's going on in the community, because there's all these very much skeletal news operations, and you had to go to like 20 places yourself and basically curate for yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think you had a session on wildfires this morning. I talked to a fire chief and a mayor in Western Canada, and they were talking about how since the terrible wildfire season of 2023, in both their communities, in one case the TV station has just moved to Vancouver, is now produced out of Vancouver, and in another case the local radio station had cut the transmitter and moved away from a news format. And so they're basically wondering how they're going to reach people in these rural areas in emergencies.
And just one last point. Sorry.
Okay.
So I'll be happy to be quiet when you pull me off the stage. We talk about disinformation. We talk about the rise of, Facebook, and it's not that people prefer to get their news from Facebook. It's easier, sure. Not Facebook in Canada. Let's say TikTok. What people are starved for that information. People want that information. People want to connect with that information. And if the only place they have to go is Facebook, then they'll go there. So as long as we preserve the existence of viable local media, we can counter this trend that's going. We're not going to fight it. We're not going to beat it. But we provide that reliable local alternative. Local stations who've built a brand over 20 years, that is a viable brand on the internet as well.
So, Leslie, I want to hear from you about the U.S. perspective, because that's where you've spent your career as a reporter, and we'll get to your business model in a moment. But there is something about being on the ground, right? Being in the local coffee shops, knowing who the local characters are, and getting the tips on the big stories to hold the local power accountable, like the local journalism. In addition to the community building, in addition to the survival information, talk a little bit about your experience with local and why local matters to you.
We spoke earlier, and I was trying to figure out in which market would be the important discussion. I worked in Santa Cruz, California, which is a tiny beach town. And I remember I was also a multitasker, or what we call a utility person. So I was also the business manager and reporter, and somebody called in a tip about a fire. And so I left with a microphone and I ran down to where the fire was. And I remember that, even though it was such a long time ago, longer than I want to even admit, how important it is to have, whether it's at the newspaper or at a radio station, TV station, it's happening too much now that we're losing that touch with community members because of money in the US. I don't know, I can't speak on Canada, but the management needs to take all of the money away from the talent. And the talent is what brings the money in. There is a backwards phenomenon happening where the talent are starting to make less and less and less and be treated like they are expendable. So, and journalists really want to be out in the public and want to be in the community. And for me personally, anchoring is easier because you're just sitting there reading or ad-libbing or talking, but it's more fun really to be out in the community. and hearing from the community, what they want, what they need, what can we give to them.
Yeah, it really is an essential relationship. And just staying with the US for a moment, we just had the news about the cuts coming to NPR and PBS. You know, and I was just watching the head of NPR on The Daily Show, of all places, talking about what that is going to mean to local news coverage and small local stations across the US. So I want to talk a little bit about you know, some of the organizations that are stepping into the gap a little bit. So April, I'll ask you about public broadcasters in a moment, but Alex, can you talk about your network of community, campus, kind of really local stations and the role they play?
So these stations are built on a network of volunteers, first of all. So the cost input is much less than what commercial stations would need. Nobody has to pay a shareholder at the end of the day. And so, you know, where April's talking about a decline in commercial broadcasters, commercial radio stations, I can tell you that there's more than a dozen community radio station groups who want to build community radio stations waiting for approval from the CRTC right now. We are seeing a growth in community level broadcasting. And this is where we speak about local and hyper-local news. This is where it is critically important. And there is a demand. We did a look at data in terms of listenership for community broadcasters over a 5-year period through the NCRA, and there was a 16% increase in listenership over those 5 years. The other element here that is growing and that is critically important is trust in the media, trust in what they say. As you said, they go out, these reporters leave the radio station at the end of the day and they go out and they sit in the bar and they go to the grocery store and they go to the hairdresser and they talk to the neighbors and they live in these communities and therefore they are impacted by what's happening in these communities. That sort of level of community connection is so important. And again, I'm going to cite my colleagues in Quebec who did an incredible study looking at the trust that communities have in reporters from community stations. And Angelica, correct me, I think we were talking about 78% feel that they either trust implicitly or there's a much higher degree of level of trust in community radio stations and the reporting that comes from community radio stations. And it all has to do with that connection, that local connection, that understanding of what it means when the power goes out in the entire town and where the boundaries are, and all of these elements. And it's not just crisis and disaster. I can cite, like April, Sydney, Nova Scotia during the hurricane Fiona, their broadcast tower was blown over. Well, they kept broadcasting. They locked themselves in the station. They ordered a whole load of pizza and water bottles and stayed on the air even as this broadcast tower was slowly leaning. But they know what's going on. And at the end of the day, when the major networks have packed up and gone, they're still there to say, here's where the community center is if you need to go get sandwiches. And here's the house that needs sandbagging still because the river levels are rising and we need to be careful about that. So that personal level of connection is so important, and it is driving, I think, and what we're seeing, a growth in hyper-local media. And so there is room, there is desire. I know that there is a sense in commercial broadcasting that you don't make money on news. No, but you do deliver on the value proposition that we have as communicators and members of our community. And it's a really important way of demonstrating the effectiveness of that value proposition.
This does come back to money and funding, and I know, Alex, you are a fierce advocate for your stations and getting funding and government money, as are the corporate bosses at CBC who are constantly, trying to make sure that we have funding to keep going at the CBC. And I will just mention here that CBC is opening 24 new small bureaus over the next few months. So there are some little glimmers, I think, of stepping back into local and stepping back into the gaps. But April, I want to ask you about where you see local organizations, local governments, like local councils, individual citizens, stepping up and coming up with interesting solutions.
Well, I think, Alex, you were mentioning that often stations don't see news as more of an expense than an opportunity. And the more I look at what's going on in all sectors of local journalism, the more I'm arriving at the conclusion that content must be king if you want to make your business work. And by that, I mean you have to be producing news that's must-have content for your community. You have to make yourself into the place where people, if there is an emergency, if there's something to celebrate, if you want to find out what those rascals at City Hall are doing, you have to be the go-to place for it. And once you have that as your, I guess, your value proposition, it makes it easier to go out and develop other revenue streams. So perhaps that is to do a fundraising campaign. People aren't going to make a donation if they don't think you're delivering anything of value. If you decide to, look at that possibility, because now the emerging consensus is that it takes at least three or four revenue sources for a local news organization to make it these days. So if you're looking at the potential for a fundraising campaign, which is not inconceivable, the more you can show that you're the go-to place and that's providing value to the community, the easier it's going to be to make money. Local foundations might consider giving you some money if you can work out the details of that. Advertisers, maybe they're not going to. It's a small market, and they don't think they're going to reach a huge number of people, or it's not as targeted as Google or Facebook, but they see you as a pillar of the community and part of the infrastructure of the community and a must-have, so they're going to buy that advertising there. City Council is going to put those announcements go to you with announcements of events of what's going on. So I just think that we have to really think about, like, what is the public good here, and happily it coincides with producing content of value. And that's also good business.
Right. Yes, and that content can live on multiple platforms, right? That's also part of the challenge or the opportunity. Leslie, I want you to talk a little bit about your business model and kind of where you're filling the gap in some communities providing local news.
Thank you for that. Essentially, how it started was I was working in Los Angeles at KFI, which was at the time the most listened to talk station in America. And I left there and moved away to Montana. And my job in Montana didn't last very long, so I started podcasting, and I started podcasting over 25 years ago, and I probably should have stayed with it. But I was making a little bit of money, and I made enough to buy a BlackBerry. And I was like, this is great, I have a BlackBerry. Something is working here. And I just had a light go off. Maybe I could email news to people, just me, myself, in Montana. And then my first client was in California. So I started to get stations for myself to anchor, because that was my idea. I would just anchor myself. And then, thankfully, for living in Montana, I was able to get enough to where, oh no, now I have to hire someone. And so I had to keep hiring people, thankfully. And it was with the idea that if you have a local person, I don't want their job. I want to be in stations that have no news, because it's very important to still have news in those stations that find news to be expendable. And so the idea was to never take a job away from someone, and it still is. If I call on a station or they call me, they will say, so-and-so's retiring, and now I can't afford a news person. So I feel comfortable sliding in there. I also still try to anchor myself at stations. I just was in touch with a station in New York City, and it's fun. So I have 25 people. We all anchor. I'm not anchoring currently, but they all anchor news and traffic for stations that otherwise cannot afford to have news. We are in major markets like Chicago and Seattle, and we're in tiny micro markets like in Kentucky and Tennessee, and also Washington State and California, and very small markets, medium, up to major.
What I find fascinating about this is it's been the development of technology in many ways that's allowed that business model to exist. And I think technology can be a friend in some instances. And there are whole other sessions on AI happening at this conference. But there's also an interesting thing happening with AI in local news, and how it can be a help, but how it can also bring its own dangers. So I just wonder, Alex, Leslie, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I find it terrifying. I really do, especially as a voice person and a manager of voice people. We've had a couple of my people have had their voices emulated and they've caught it. And I also kind of call myself the content police because AI is not right. And, you know, we already have a problem in the United States with myths and disinformation, and we don't need to add on to that. And to have a voice that doesn't breathe and cuts, you know, it's like a bad edit. And it doesn't help the cause for even air personalities, you know, to have a local air personality expendable, because now the managers think, oh, we can save money and I can make more money. And it's just like, you know, we're already losing so many jobs in America. Like, why do we have to now use technology to make people, again, expendable?
Is there anything, Alex, that AI can do that frees people up to do local news? Like, is there a good version of this, do you think?
Well, I was going to say, I, for one, embrace and welcome our new AI overlords.
If they're listening.
Put my phone down. So first of all, I agree with Leslie. I think we will get in a real problem if we have Vocaloid voice boxes doing the work for us in terms of replacing anchors and journalists. If we have AI doing the research for journalism, we're in a very troubling space because there's a huge amount of cannibalization of other AI data that's going in there. On the other hand, as I mentioned briefly, you know, we in community radio stations, it's frequent to see 1 or 2 paid staff. And that happens a lot. So to be able to get box scores and just generate box scores, fantastic. If you're doing a market report, you know, you don't need a genius to go and figure out what's going on the NASDAQ and the TSX. So to use AI to do that. We have to be in a million different places, social media for one. A friend of mine was recently teaching me how to use AI to be able to generate social media posts based on viable content that we've generated. But you can do it in a moment. And you have all of a sudden a massive presence on social media where maybe you can't afford a comms person in your radio station. So there are places where we can leverage this technology that is not going away, whether we like it or not. God love you. But we need to figure out how we do it in the right way. How do we do it and be true to our core journalism, make sure that people are behind the selection of the music, but maybe you can let AI figure out what's A, B, and C on the rotation.
Yeah, I think it's a good news, bad news story, very much, AI. So on just, there's lots of bad news examples, but you know, there's really innovative ways that new tools are being developed. So I was just reading about one development of a tool where AI searches all these council. Say you cover an area with multiple municipalities and you can't be at every council meeting. There's an AI tool. They're building an AI tool to look at all those council proceedings and extract potential news stories out of them that then the reporters can follow up on. You can use, I think, AI effectively to provide a two or three sentence summary of a longer story at the top of a story. Its translation tools are all pretty good. None of this can be done without human oversight. Another case, making an archive of your newsroom archives more easily searchable using AI. So these are, I think, helpful things that we need to also embrace. I mean, the learning curve is huge, and the ethics and how transparent you are about this is a huge issue that we're still trying to work through. And how do you disclose where and how you've used AI to produce articles or produce news or produce content for your show? So that's still being done. But I just saw a small South African youth website, and they've actually made a checklist for the reporters on various ways to use AI. And so you finish the story, and then you check which ones you used. I used it to translate, or I used it to summarize, or I used it, for basic research, or and then it generates sort of a thing to go go with the story. Here's how AI was used in the production of this story.
So people say they want local news in survey after survey after survey, if you ask people, and yet, what's getting in the way of it being delivered, or other models of funding, or organizing ourselves to better deliver it? People want it, but they don't want to pay for it. Where's that disconnect?
I think there's a way to do both. I think you give your people what they want, and then you get advertisers to support it. Why do they need to pay for it? If they want that information, it can be supported just like NPR or public radio gets sponsorships. You get sponsorships. It's not difficult.
I think there's an important and evolving role for foundations, charitables, corporate investment in things they feel important. I will say our colleagues in the United States are well advanced when it comes to this conversation. There's an awful lot more foundational support for news generation in the United States, but we're seeing growth in that in Canada too. So I was recently at a democracy exchange conversation where groups like the Michener Foundation, groups like the Rita Hall Foundation, Inspire, Inspirit, and others are coming to the table and putting together funding in support of what is truly a societal good. I think that's really important. As April and I were talking a moment ago, there's a huge demand for that kind of funding, and there's not nearly enough of it right now. And April's doing some incredible work on that front. I also think we need to look at areas of strength and not duplicate. I think we need to look at partnerships amongst news gathering organizations. I was reading, and we were talking about this a moment ago, an article on the CBC this morning about deep fakes and pornography sites and international collaboration. And I mean, it was exceptional journalism. That is where public broadcasters excel. Community broadcasters excel in the local, hyper-local, truly local news and information. And why aren't we working closer together to create a conversation where news is at the core of the information and not who's doing what, where, when? We need to stop competing with one another about who's going to break that news story first and say, that's a fascinating story. Now let me take this hyper, the web fake story and bring it back to what's happening in Pontiac, Quebec. And I think that we need to, as a news group, as people who are collectively interested in this, look at how we work together, how we support other great journalism, and how we make stories that matter, give it air and give it a lift. And when we start doing that, I think we'll see more foundational support and more charitable support. We even have an oil company that is interested in reinvesting in its communities where it works, promoting and supporting a radio program about Indigenous languages. There's desire.
Can I jump in? I have gone to big companies and said, you have like 50 news reporter help wanteds, God bless you, on your website. And if these are fake ads, for whatever reason, you need to put those up there for the government, I don't know. But why don't you partner with us? I have all these reporters all over the country, and I've been told it's because local ad dollars will then disappear from us and go elsewhere. I have a newspaper that I work with directly in Lake County, California, and I've become really close friends with the publisher. And she's like, just use anything you want. I don't care. We're helping each other. And that's how it should be, instead of, oh no, you're going to steal my ad dollars. I'm not. I want to create something for the community so they get their news.
Right.
If I
April, just one second. I just want to say we are going to have time to take a few questions. So if you've got questions, get them ready. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions. So go ahead, April.
Yeah, I just also would really make the case for collaboration, even in a local market. You know, everybody's operating on a shoestring, so it's very difficult to undertake a bigger project, for instance, because you're just struggling to get the news out every day. But if say the local struggling newspaper and the sort of news radio station that has very limited number of journalists can work together on a project, you can divide up various aspects of the project and publish it. And I think all benefit because, it demonstrates commitment to the community. And to go back to my original point, that makes people willing to give you money, whether it's in the form of advertising or donations or foundation support, or to come out at an event you might organize that you need a sponsorship for about whatever the issue is that you're doing. I mean, I'm not saying collaboration is easy. There's actually a skill to it, and you discover. I've worked a little bit on some collaborative projects, and all sorts of things jump up and hit you in the face that you didn't think of. So it takes trust between the parties. But I think the days of when everybody is I think of it as a skeleton with bones rattling around, and we're all trying to, I got that story 20 minutes before you did. I question the value of that if you are thinking in terms of serving the public good in your communities.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions? Sorry, it's hard to see. Are
Any
there
questions? Yeah. Here we go.
Hello. Hi.
Thank you for everything you've shared today. I appreciate it and echo it. My question is about foreign interference. Our radio stations have multicultural formats, and they serve really distinct communities in third language in Canada. And what can I ask or offer to the CRTC for regulatory help in foreign interference specifically? And I don't know if there's examples from the US or any other countries that we could look to, but how can you make me look smart to ask for help in this area?
So I would say it's hard to regulate new international interference. It's a bit like trying to hold sand in your hand. Once it's out, and it's very difficult to try and put in place a law that will prevent it. My argument is always, let's flood the field with good local information. And so if you're doing broadcasting in the languages that your community speaks, if you have a program that does, I think of a fantastic program in Ottawa that's in Farsi that speaks to Iranian women, right? Interpreting the news during that, what's happening in Iran through a local lens, but from the voice of a person who understands that story is so important. And my conversations with the federal government in Canada, they're very interested in the fact that community radio stations in Canada broadcast programming in more than 65 different languages. We need to promote the fact that we are in those spaces doing that news and interpreting international news for a local audience, and that local diaspora still needs to be served.
Another question?
Sorry for my accent. First of all, I apologize. I'm here. I'm Sylvain Chamberlain. I'm owner of 26 radio station in Quebec. In fact, we are the biggest radio broadcaster in Quebec. So I'm talking about something that I know, local news, and I agree with all what you said, of course. But I have a comment. When we talk, is local news matter? Of course. Is that important? Of course. And our DNA, my company, our DNA is local news because I work in news industries all my life. But there's one thing, who talk about local news, talk about journalists. So I just want to say there's something in the discussion very important. There's no more journalists. And who want to come to some place that nobody knows, like Abitibi? It's so far, so far. It takes 3 times to go in Abitibi that it takes for me to come here.
I'll
3
come
times
to you.
the time. So no, it's very far.
I wanna learn French.
And other thing, for example, I have mom and pop shop in some community of 3,000 or 4,000 people. This is so small. And even there, we offer a local news platform and all that stuff. But do you think some journalists waiting there for me and say, hey, I'm journalist. I'm just waiting for your call, man. Wow, I dream to be journalist in Abitibi. No.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
but
no,
I
no
think the
problem.
question is, how do we get journalists to go to these smaller communities?
But
and
I think
become
it's
local
what I
reporters?
want to say. It's a problem. That's a big problem because over the top that we said it's important. Of course it is, but you have to find people. You have to pay them. If you have to pay $100,000 for a journalist in local news. I'm in competition with Montreal and newspaper journalists who receive
Okay.
some money and all
Sir,
that stuff. So it's
I just want to make sure we
complicated.
get to all the questions, and I think, April, you had a thought on that?
Yeah, one of the things, I mean, you did mention that. I mean, one of the challenges for students is looking for these kinds of positions is that they don't get enough money to live on. And that's just the fundamental problem of it. They need a car, they need a place to live, they need to relocate, and they need to, buy groceries. And so often when I hear complaints from local media about that, I say, well, what do you pay? And then you find out that, I mean, I couldn't live on it. I'm not even sure I could live on it when I started. But I mean, maybe there's the potential for you to partner with, I don't know, the local newspaper or somebody else in the region to make a pool of funds to hire a reporter who's going to cover, I don't know, all the municipal news. I'm just thinking there may be some creative solutions to acknowledge is a difficult problem.
Salut, Sylvain. I will say, just very quickly, the other thought here is let's redefine what a journalist is. You don't have to have gone to journalism school to be a member of that community and to care what's going on at City Hall. We have journalists who work in the local journalism initiative who are school teachers, who are librarians, who come from a variety of different backgrounds, who are very interested in their community and want to do this work. Maybe they've already got a job doing something else. I just think we don't need to specifically get a journalism grad to come in and do this, although obviously we want that training. But we have to redefine that a little bit too.
If I can just jump in there, I was approached by a small chain of newspapers in Manitoba by the publisher who said, I can't get any journalists to work for me or any journalism students. So she's hired a couple of people with, I think, English degrees. She said, but I don't know how to train them. I don't know where to get training for them. And it's expensive. I said, well, why don't you just hire a coach for them? So actually she reached out and I did a few coaching sessions with a couple of these reporters. And they're telling me it made a difference. So I hope it did.
Exactly. I used to go after little college stations and say, just let me coach these kids so that they want to do radio. We don't even have a broadcast journalism degree in some of these colleges anymore, which I got. Now I don't even know what they call it anymore.
Communications.
Liberal studies.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
I just took over a newsroom, so I've been told many times now I'm not a journalist, and I'm not. But one of the things you guys talked about, you talked a lot about why it matters. And one of the things that I feel like I'm running into a lot is they want to tell me that it's important, and I sort of look and go, important to who and what, and and oftentimes importance seems to be in place of relevance to people. And
Who are they?
The journalists with a capital J in the room,
That's called ego.
and I just wonder, we talked about why it matters, and I think it is important, but what is the future? I mean, are there big ideas? Because look, if we can attract audiences, then there will be money for it. But what I see is things being done the same way as it was done 30 and 40 years ago, in no real recognition of a changed environment, media environment, and we're trying to hold on to a lot of things that just real people don't care about.
Yeah. I think that showing your value as a local news source is actually a challenge. So beyond saying there should be more, we should do a better job, I think, of showing our value in the communities that we are in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you might be talking to the wrong people. I think you need to talk to the people in your community and ask them what they think is important and what the stories are, and use that as your starting point. So there's a bunch of different models about that. Community listening circles. You invite, the public in and basically set up a few tables and have a moderator at every table and listen to people about what they think is important, and then actually respond to those concerns. So that would be where I would start, because apart from, when I say producing quality content, that's about producing content that matters to people, and you have to find out what matters to them.
When I was
Last word to you, Alex. I see the red light flashing there.
Red light, red light. When I was a consumer journalist, we always thought about what is important. Well, it's what matters to my pocketbook. Right? Is my family safe? Am I safe? Where are the health care challenges? What these are commonalities amongst everybody, and I think the more you focus on that, the more again we'll deliver that value proposition. And finally, we have to remember that we're also storytellers, and people engage with narrative. People engage with stories, and it's not just what you're saying, but it's how you're saying it that becomes really important. And think about how you're delivering the information, because it becomes increasingly palatable to people if you're delivering it in a way that we've always, since time immemorial, communicated through storytelling.
I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank April, Alex, and Leslie. Thank you so much.